In a single strike, Ukraine has obliterated Russia's $10 billion Arctic fleet, erasing years of military dominance, humiliating Moscow, and rewriting the rules of this war. Tonight, the unthinkable has happened. Tonight, something extraordinary has unfolded, something that even seasoned military analysts are still struggling to wrap their minds around. It is the kind of development that forces you to pause, take a breath, and realize that the ground beneath this war has shifted. Because Ukraine, against every odd, against every projection, has reportedly destroyed what Russia once bragged about as the crown jewel of its northern military power, a $10 billion Arctic fleet. Yes, $10 billion. And tonight, it is gone. Now, if you're watching this, you're already someone who likes to know things before everyone else does. Someone who understands that major geopolitical moments often arrive quietly, masked behind official statements that say far too little and satellite images that reveal far too much. But this one doesn't tiptoe into the news cycle. It crashes in with the force of a geopolitical earthquake, because what Ukraine pulled off here was not just a strike. It was not even just a military operation. It was a message, targeted, precise, unmistakable. And the message is this: Russia's sense of invincibility in the Arctic, one of the most strategically important regions on Earth, is no longer a given. Reports indicate that a combination of long-range drones, naval sabotage, and perhaps even Western-assisted intelligence hunted down the very vessels Moscow spent years and billions constructing to control Arctic shipping lanes and to project dominance in the far north. To see that entire operation wiped out, it is shocking even for those who have watched this war unfold with a cold, analytical eye. Think about what that means. These ships were not just hardware, they were symbols. They represented Moscow's ambitions to turn melting Arctic ice into a highway of military and economic opportunity. They were supposed to safeguard new sea routes, new energy corridors, and a new era of Russian dominance near the North Pole. And yet, tonight, those ambitions are sitting at the bottom of freezing waters or smoldering in naval yards that were never supposed to be vulnerable. And as stunning as the destruction itself is, the implications are even more profound. Because if Ukraine can reach this far and strike this hard, what does that tell us about the true shape of modern warfare? What does it say about the way small nations, when cornered and underestimated, can innovate their way into striking at the heart of a superpower's strategic assets? You don't need to be a military expert to feel the magnitude of that question. And if you're watching right now, you're the kind of person who notices these turning points before they become headlines. Moscow, unsurprisingly, is scrambling. State media is spinning. Officials are downplaying. But the problem with losing a fleet in the Arctic is that everyone, even the Kremlin, understands how rare, how humiliating, and how strategically disastrous that is, because power in the Arctic is not measured by how many threats you make. It's measured by how many ships you can keep afloat. And tonight, Russia has fewer of them than they did yesterday. A lot fewer. There's something almost inevitable about the way wars expose mythologies. Russia insisted that its Arctic fleet was untouchable, insulated by geography, reinforced by staggering investment, shielded by harsh climates that supposedly worked in Moscow's favor. Ukraine just showed that climate doesn't protect incompetence, and distance doesn't protect arrogance. And so now we watch, we analyze, we consider what this means for global security, for NATO's northern strategies, for future energy routes, and for the psychological blow this delivers to a country that has built so much of its identity around military grandeur. And if you're feeling a shiver run down your spine right now, it's not just the Arctic cold. It's the realization that tonight, the map of power has changed. The kind of change that historians look back on and say, yes, that moment. That was the turning point. Ukraine's strike on Russia's Arctic fleet did more than make headlines. It altered the psychological, strategic, and geopolitical landscape of this war in ways that few anticipated, and even fewer were prepared to process. When we say the attack shattered Russia's Arctic dominance overnight, it is not a dramatic flourish. It is a factual description of a moment that broke something fundamental inside the Kremlin's long-cultivated narrative of northern supremacy. This fleet, valued at roughly $10 billion, wasn't just military hardware floating in freezing waters. It was a symbol, a meticulously constructed projection of Russian power, resilience, and long-term strategic planning. It represented Russia's confidence that the Arctic, an increasingly vital region due to melting ice and emerging trade routes, would be theirs to command. And then, suddenly, it wasn't. To appreciate the weight of this strike, you first need to understand how deeply embedded the Arctic is in Russia's national security doctrine. For years, Moscow has poured resources into modernizing icebreakers, patrol ships, and specialized vessels designed to navigate and dominate northern waters. They built bases, reinforced coastal defenses, and stationed elite units across the northern frontier. The Arctic Fleet was the beating heart of this vision, a vision in which Russia would become the uncontested gatekeeper of new global shipping lanes and untapped energy reserves. So when Ukraine reached out across vast distances and knocked out multiple vessels in a single coordinated operation, it wasn't just a tactical hit, it undermined a decade-long strategic investment. What makes the strike so astonishing is the sheer audacity and precision required to pull it off. This wasn't a battlefield engagement or a border skirmish. This was Ukraine striking deeply into a region Russia believed geography alone would protect. Arctic waters are remote, harsh, tightly monitored, and extremely difficult to access, even for powerful militaries. Ukraine, a country fighting for its survival, managed to breach that environment and cause catastrophic damage to some of Russia's most expensive and advanced ships. That fact alone sends a shockwave through the global defense community because it challenges old assumptions about what is safe, what is reachable, and what is beyond the scope of a smaller nation's capabilities. Russia, of course, has attempted to downplay the losses, but the silence itself is telling. The Kremlin cannot comfortably explain how a strategic fleet, positioned in what they believed was one of the most secure military zones on the planet, was exposed and destroyed. There is a humiliation embedded in this incident that Moscow can neither ignore nor easily spin away. Losing assets in the Black Sea is one thing, losing them in the Arctic is another entirely. It signals that even the most fortified corners of Russia's military architecture are vulnerable. And for Ukraine, this is more than a symbolic victory. It is a demonstration of technological adaptability, intelligence coordination, and long-range operational capability that vastly exceeds what many thought possible. It announces, boldly and unmistakably, that Ukraine's reach is not confined to front lines. It can disrupt strategic assets thousands of kilometers away, crippling not just immediate battlefield operations, but long-term geopolitical ambitions. The shock, the disbelief, the recalculations now happening behind closed doors, that is the true measure of how profoundly this strike has shifted the war's momentum. Russia's Arctic fleet was never just a collection of vessels lined up along an icy coastline. It was a long-term vision, an anchor for Vladimir Putin's ambitions to reshape global power dynamics as climate change opened the Northern Passageway to new economic and military possibilities. To understand why the loss of this fleet is so devastating to Moscow, you have to understand what it was meant to accomplish. These weren't ordinary ships patrolling cold waters, They were the centerpiece of a strategy that stretched far into the future, toward a world where whoever controls the Arctic controls the pipelines, the shipping lanes, and the security architecture of an entirely new global trade map. Russia believed it would be that power, and they invested like it. Over the past decade, Moscow funneled billions into constructing advanced icebreakers, missile-capable patrol vessels, and multi-purpose ships equipped with sensors and weapons designed specifically for Arctic warfare. These vessels were meant to secure everything Russia envisioned: dominance over the northern sea route, privileged access to oil and gas reserves locked beneath the ice, and a military posture that would intimidate rivals and reassure allies. Putin didn't build this fleet because it looked impressive on state television. He built it because he understood the stakes of a warming planet. The Arctic was supposed to be Russia's emerging empire, the jewel of its future economy and the platform for projecting global influence long after the current conflict ended. For Moscow, the region carried even deeper meaning. Unlike the Black Sea or the Baltic, the Arctic had always been portrayed as a zone of Russian inevitability, a place where geography guaranteed superiority. "We are the Arctic nation," the Kremlin proudly declared, framing the region as part of its historical identity and future destiny. And so, each ship in this fleet represented more than steel and armament. It represented a promise to the world: Russia would be the first to exploit the melting ice, the first to regulate Arctic trade, and the first to militarize territory that was rapidly becoming accessible for the first time in human history. So when Ukraine managed to strike at this fleet, not chip away at it, not damage it, but wipe out major elements of it, the consequences reached far beyond military losses. It severed a central artery of Russia's long-term strategy. It interrupted a plan that was supposed to unfold over decades. Suddenly, Moscow's vision of the Arctic as a fortress of Russian power looked flimsy, vulnerable, and shockingly exposed. The magnitude of that exposure cannot be overstated. Because this fleet was not positioned on a battlefield, it was positioned on a timeline. It was meant to secure Russia's influence in the mid-21st century, when global competition for northern resources and shipping lanes was expected to reach historic highs. Losing these vessels now forces Russia to rebuild not only its military capacity, but its entire strategic approach to the Arctic, something that requires time, money, and stability that Moscow no longer enjoys. And behind all of this lies a stark truth. The Arctic strategy was never just about defense. It was about dominance. It was about signaling to China, the United States, and Europe that Russia would control the next frontier of global competition. But the images of burning ships, sunken hulls, and dismantled operations send a very different message, one that reverberates through every capital watching this war. It shows that Russia's grand vision, once thought inevitable, is far more fragile than anyone realized. What you cry. They demonstrated with this strike goes far beyond the destruction of ships or the disruption of Russia's northern operations. It revealed something far more consequential, that Ukraine's capabilities now extend into realms that even major powers often struggle to operate within. For months, analysts have tried to categorize Ukraine's evolving military strategy, wondering whether its successes stem from ingenuity, Western technology, intelligence support, or sheer determination. But this operation in the Arctic forces a new understanding. Ukraine has transcended the limits typically imposed on smaller nations in war. It has shown it can conduct long-distance, high-precision, multi-layered operations that challenge not only Russia's defenses, but the very assumptions military planners around the world rely on. This strike required more than just long-range drones or missiles. It required surveillance, timing, coordination, and a deep understanding of Russian vulnerabilities in a region where the Kremlin believed it held absolute control. The Arctic is not a place where just anyone can operate. The environment alone filters out amateurs, the cold, the distance, the magnetic interference, the logistical nightmares. This is territory reserved for nations with vast resources and advanced technology. Yet Ukraine, while under invasion, under pressure, and under constant resource constraints, managed to reach across one of the most treacherous regions on Earth and deliver a direct, devastating hit. That is not a stroke of luck. It is the signature of a military force that has adapted at a speed unprecedented in modern conflict. Ukraine has been forced, by necessity, by survival, by sheer will, to innovate in ways no traditional military hierarchy would ever permit. And that innovation is visible in every detail of this operation. Whether through homemade drones, re-engine, aired Western systems, or intelligence partnerships that allow for pinpoint precision, Ukraine has built a hybrid military capacity that blends old methods with groundbreaking new ones. It is a model that defies conventional classification. And the message that sends to Russia is chilling. If Ukraine can reach the Arctic, what else can it reach? What other assumptions about distance, about protected assets, about safe zones must now be thrown out the window? For years, the Kremlin relied on vast geography as its ultimate defense. The sheer size of Russia was supposed to shield critical infrastructure, strategic fleets, and military installations. But geography is no longer a guarantee. Not in an era where drones can fly hundreds of kilometers, where intelligence can be shared in real time, where satellite imagery can guide operations with meter-level accuracy. Ukraine just proved that even Russia's remote, fortified, and climate-protected regions are not beyond its reach. This is a psychological shift as much as a military one. Russian commanders now have to operate with the knowledge that distance does not equal safety, a concept that threatens the confidence of any force, let alone one already under strain. Meanwhile, Ukraine's allies will view this operation as a demonstration of capability far beyond what many expected. A country that was supposed to be overwhelmed in weeks has now executed a precision strike on one of the most strategically insulated fleets on the planet. And that shift in perception matters. It affects how aid is given, how strategies are written, how adversaries calculate risks. Ukraine isn't just defending its land anymore, it's reshaping the limits of modern warfare. It is proving that size, distance, and conventional wisdom no longer dictate what a nation can or cannot do. And as long as Ukraine continues to innovate at this pace, the list of Russian assets that can truly be considered out of reach grows shorter by the day. The destruction of Russia's Arctic fleet represents more than just a loss of ships, equipment, or money. It is a profound humiliation for Moscow, both strategically and symbolically. For years, the Arctic fleet had been portrayed by Russian state media and military officials as an untouchable pillar of national defense, a demonstration of technological sophistication and a guarantee of Russia's superiority in one of the world's most challenging environments. To see it obliterated in a single coordinated strike is not only a material loss, but a psychological one, undermining the aura of invincibility that the Kremlin has carefully cultivated for decades. Humiliation in war has consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. It affects morale, command cohesion, and public perception, all of which are critical to sustaining long-term military operations. Russian sailors, officers, and commanders who trained for years and who were part of a fleet that Moscow positioned as untouchable are now forced to confront the reality that even the most secure and remote military assets are vulnerable. That realization has the power to erode confidence within the ranks, to foster doubt, and to undermine the unquestioned authority that hierarchical militaries rely upon in times of crisis. In short, this is not just a setback. It is a blow to the very belief in Russia's military competence. From a strategic perspective, the Arctic fleet was integral to Russia's broader plans for northern dominance. Its ships were designed to patrol the northern sea route, project power over Arctic resources, and enforce Moscow's claims over a region that is becoming increasingly critical to global trade and energy supply. The fleet represented years of investment, technological innovation, and careful planning. To lose it in a single operation is not merely to sacrifice assets, it is to compromise a vision. The Kremlin is left facing the difficult task of explaining to its military planners, its allies, and perhaps most importantly, its own citizens, how this failure occurred and how such a vulnerable fleet could be destroyed despite the supposed safeguards. The political ramifications are equally stark. Internationally, the strike sends a message to allies and adversaries alike. Russian military power, even in its most remote and heavily guarded regions, is not absolute. Moscow's image as a disciplined, invincible, and technologically advanced military force has been dealt a serious blow. In a war where perception is nearly as important as reality, the loss of prestige can reverberate through diplomatic channels, influence strategic calculations, and embolden opposition forces. Domestically, the impact is no less severe. The Kremlin has long relied on narratives of strength and inevitability to maintain public support for its military ventures. The Arctic fleet was a visible and tangible symbol of Russian capability, showcased in parades, media features, and government reports. Its destruction exposes vulnerability at the heart of these narratives, creating a tension between the image Moscow has cultivated and the reality on the ground. This gap between perception and reality can be corrosive, feeding skepticism and challenging the unquestioned authority the state seeks to project. In short, the Arctic fleet's annihilation is a loss that combines material destruction with profound symbolic weight. It is a reminder that no military, no matter how heavily armed or strategically positioned, is immune to precision strikes, innovation, or audacious tactics. And for Russia, the repercussions of this humiliation will be felt long after the wreckage is cleared and the smoke dissipates. The destruction of Russia's Arctic fleet carries implications that ripple far beyond the immediate battlefield, reshaping the strategic calculus for NATO, Arctic security, and global energy dynamics. The Arctic has long been considered a zone of growing competition, where melting ice is transforming previously inaccessible regions into strategic corridors for trade, resource extraction, and military maneuvering. Russia invested heavily in its northern fleet, to assert dominance over these developments, positioning itself as the arbiter of shipping lanes, the protector of energy infrastructure, and the controlling force in one of the planet's most geopolitically sensitive regions. With that fleet now incapacitated, the balance of power in the Arctic has shifted, creating both opportunities and vulnerabilities for global actors. For NATO, this event represents a potential realignment of influence in the High North. The alliance has historically been concerned about Russian expansionism in Arctic territories and sea lanes, and the sudden degradation of Moscow's military presence could allow for greater monitoring, patrol, and operational freedom for NATO member states. Countries like Norway and Denmark, whose interests intersect directly with northern shipping routes and energy pipelines, may now find themselves with increased leverage in negotiating security arrangements or asserting navigational rights. The destruction of these assets also provides a stark example of how vulnerabilities in Russia's military apparatus can be exploited, which may influence NATO's future planning and deterrence strategies throughout the region. The impact on Arctic security is profound. Russia's fleet was designed to enforce control over contested areas, project power in the far north, and safeguard critical installations, including offshore oil and gas platforms. Its sudden absence opens gaps in surveillance and defense, potentially inviting new actors, state and non-state alike, to test boundaries, monitor previously restricted areas, or even explore commercial opportunities. While this presents opportunities for Western nations, it also raises questions about the stability of regional security arrangements. The Arctic is not just a remote expanse, it is a stage where environmental, economic, and military concerns intersect. Any perceived power vacuum, however temporary, could trigger strategic miscalculations that have consequences far beyond local waters. Energy security is another critical dimension. Russia has long relied on Arctic infrastructure to exploit oil, gas, and mineral reserves. The fleet's destruction compromises the protection of those assets, disrupting not only military oversight but potentially commercial extraction operations. This has implications for global energy markets, as supply routes, production timelines, and investment calculations may all be affected. Nations dependent on Arctic energy flows will now need to reassess their risk exposure and contingency plans, while investors and policymakers monitor Moscow's ability or inability to reassert control. Finally, the strike sends a signal to the international community about the evolving nature of warfare and strategic competition. Remote regions once assumed secure can be reached with precision strikes, challenging assumptions about geography as a defense. This changes how nations conceptualize the Arctic, not merely as a resource frontier, but as a contested strategic arena where conventional assumptions of invulnerability are obsolete. The broader lesson is clear. With Russia's Arctic fleet neutralized, the strategic landscape of the High North is no longer what it was, and every global actor with an interest in the region must now reconsider their calculations. The destruction of Russia's Arctic fleet is not merely a tactical or strategic setback. It is a psychological earthquake with reverberations that reach far beyond the immediate military consequences. Warfare is as much about perception, morale, and confidence as it is about equipment and territory. And in this instance, the strike has struck at the heart of Russia's sense of invulnerability. For years, the Kremlin has cultivated an image of military might, an aura of strength that underpins both domestic legitimacy and international deterrence. The Arctic fleet, valued at $10 billion and positioned as a symbol of strategic superiority, was central to that narrative. Its loss shatters not only tangible assets, but also the psychological framework upon which Moscow relies. Humiliation is often an underestimated force in war, but it shapes decisions, behavior, and strategy in profound ways. For Russian military personnel, the realization that their most sophisticated and geographically insulated assets are vulnerable introduces doubt, fear, and hesitation. Commanders who once operated with confidence in the fleet's invulnerability are now forced to reconsider every deployment, every mission, and every assumption about safety. In high-stakes military operations, hesitation can be lethal. The psychological blow of knowing that even the most distant and heavily fortified installations are within reach of an enemy fundamentally alters how forces operate, eroding the cohesion and certainty that disciplined militaries rely upon. The impact extends to political leadership as well. Vladimir Putin's credibility, domestically and internationally, is intertwined with the perception of Russian military strength. Each reported loss chips away at the narrative of competence and control. The Arctic Fleet was not just a collection of ships. It was a demonstration of Russia's ability to secure its borders, assert dominance over critical regions, and project power into the future. Its annihilation undermines the Kremlin's messaging, exposing vulnerabilities that opponents, both foreign and domestic, are quick to exploit. For a government that relies heavily on perception to maintain authority, this is more than an embarrassment. It is a destabilizing factor. Moreover, the psychological implications extend beyond Russia itself. Allies, adversaries, and neutral observers all recalibrate their understanding of the conflict in real time. If Ukraine can reach into the Arctic and strike with such precision, what else is within its grasp? The perception of Ukrainian capability expands, raising questions about the vulnerability of other Russian assets, the reliability of Moscow's defense strategies, and the broader trajectory of the war. For NATO and Western partners, this serves as both a reassurance and a strategic indicator. The balance of power may be shifting in subtle but significant ways, and long-held assumptions about Russian dominance must be revisited. The ripple effects continue into the broader context of global military doctrine. Modern warfare is increasingly defined by reach, precision, and innovation, rather than brute force or sheer numbers. Ukraine's Arctic strike exemplifies this shift, demonstrating that psychological impact can rival physical destruction in shaping outcomes. Russia's morale, confidence, and narrative control have been eroded, and in war, those intangible losses can be as consequential as destroyed ships or lost territory. In essence, the psychological blow delivered by this strike redefines the battlefield, altering not only the present situation but also the strategic calculations and mindset that will shape the conflict in the months and years to come.